There's something nobody tells you. The more you begin to see human behavior as it truly is, the fewer people you can keep around you, the fewer people you can keep close. Not because you become cold, but why don't you stop pretending you don't see? Most people believe that having many friends is a sign of worth. But what if I told you that in practice, this is almost always a sign of distraction, or even naivete? Because the more you understand about power, about influence, about how people really work, it becomes more difficult to trust lightly, automatically, and recklessly. Machiavelli already made it clear. The world is not guided by ideals. It is guided by interests, perceptions, and invisible forces. And when you start to see that, something changes. You start talking less, keep an eye on things, to make better choices, and little by little, its circle shrinks. But not because you lost people. Yes, because you stopped fooling yourself about them. And perhaps that's the question no one wants to ask. If you truly saw people as they are, how many would still stay by her side? If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now, not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder. You are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. He notices this early on, earlier than most would like to admit. The idea that people know how to keep secrets is a comfortable illusion, but still an illusion. In practice, human beings are driven by validation, belonging, status. And sharing information is a silent way to achieve all of that. When someone tells you something in confidence, it's often because it's already been told before, just with a different narrative. And here's where a simple but brutal principle comes in. Information is power. Those who understand this begin to realize that every detail revealed about themselves ceases to be just a story and becomes a tool in the hands of another person. It's not about paranoia. It's about politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Because in the real world, it's not the most transparent person who wins. It's the most strategic person who wins. Machiavelli already pointed this out when he showed that the appearance of virtue often matters more than its revealed essence. And when someone exposes too much of their true self, they lose control of their own narrative. A simple example. At work, that harmless conversation about your insecurities could turn into an argument in a future meeting. Among friends, a poorly positioned vulnerability can become a joke, or worse, a point of comparison. Not because they are all bad, but because few resist the temptation to use what they know. And those who understand this start to speak less, not out of fear, but as a strategy. Because deep down, he had already realized something unsettling. Perhaps the problem was never what he said, but who was listening. He then begins to notice patterns. It's not what people say when they're alone with him, but what happens after they leave. Because secrets are rarely broken directly. They leak out in fragments, in hints, in subtle changes in behavior. And this reveals something even deeper. Most people don't share information out of malice. They share it on impulse. Out of a need to feel relevant, to participate, to know something that others don't know. That's where the real game comes in. It's not about trusting or not trusting. It's about understanding how people work. Decisions based on real human nature, not idealizations. He realizes that by talking too much, he's giving away pieces of a puzzle that someone else can put together, however they want. And when that puzzle is complete, your image no longer belongs to you. Therefore, he begins to apply something simple: radical selectivity. Not everyone needs to know what you think. Not everyone deserves to know how you feel. Not everyone needs to know what you're planning. This isn't coldness, it's the calculated use of force. Because in this game, silence is not absence, it's positioning. And those who master this begin to realize that true power lies not in what you reveal, but in what you choose to keep hidden. Over time, he changes the way he positions himself in the world. Don't stop connecting, but learn to filter. He understands that oversharing creates an illusion of closeness, but also creates unnecessary vulnerability. And vulnerability in the wrong context becomes a bargaining chip. Then he starts doing something that few people do: thinking before speaking, simple but rare. He wonders, will what I'm about to say strengthen me or expose me? Because in the end justifies the means, and speaking without a strategy rarely leads to good results. He begins to observe who keeps what they hear to themselves and who redistributes information as if it were social currency. And gradually, he builds his own circle of trust, small, tested, consistent, as if he were forming his own loyal armies, not in battle, but in relationships. And even so, it maintains a layer of reserve, because it understands that people change, contexts change, interests change. Virtue and fortune are always at stake. And it is precisely at this point that a doubt begins to arise. If even the simplest secrets slip out, what happens when what you reveal starts to affect the egos of the people around you? He realizes this not at first, but when he starts to grow up. As long as he was just like everyone else, there was comfort, there was acceptance, there was even encouragement. But something changes the moment he starts to deviate from the average, because success is not just a personal achievement, it's a reflection. And not everyone likes what they see when they compare themselves. That person who used to laugh with you now starts observing you with a certain silence. The one who used to say it will work out starts asking questions filled with doubt. It's not explicit, it's not declared, but it's felt. And this is where a point comes in that few have the courage to admit. People love you as long as you don't threaten the narrative they've created about themselves. Because ultimately, better to be feared than loved starts to make sense. Not in the sense of causing fear, but in the sense of not depending on approval. Machiavelli already made it clear. Emotional stability cannot be in the hands of others because love is volatile and often conditional. And when your growth reveals how much someone has stood still, you cease to be an inspiration and become a source of discomfort. And this discomfort is rarely dealt with maturely. He then begins to notice subtle signs, comments disguised as jokes, subtle comparisons, silence where there was once enthusiasm, and in some cases even an inexplicable estrangement. But it's not inexplicable. It's just not said out loud, because admitting to envy, frustration, or inadequacy requires a level of awareness that few possess. So what do people do? They adjust the narrative. They distort its trajectory. They downplay their achievements. They create justifications to feel comfortable again. Ah, he was lucky. Ah, that's not all there is to it. Ah, I would too if I wanted to. And that's it. Their minds are protected. But this teaches you something powerful. The appearance of virtue is one of the greatest social currencies that exist. Because not everyone wants to grow. Many just want to look good in front of others. And when you truly grow up, you break that silent game. It is at this point that he begins to adjust his posture. Not to diminish, but to understand the ground we are standing on. He learns that growth requires constant adaptability, not just in strategies, But in relationships, not everyone will be able to keep up with your progress, and that's okay. The mistake lies in trying to pull everyone along. That costs energy, focus, and often direction. He's starting to be more selective about where he shares his victories. Not every achievement needs an audience. Not all progress needs to be announced. Sometimes silence protects more than applause inspires. And that's not arrogance. It's applied emotional intelligence, because avoiding being hated doesn't mean hiding, but rather knowing when to show up. It continues to grow, but with more strategy, better environmental awareness, and greater consciousness. And deep down, you begin to understand something even more profound. If even success changes the way people see you, what about the relationships that are built when you start to depend on them? He begins to realize this subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. The help comes as a noble gesture, a favor here, another there, and everything seems natural. But with time, something changes. That support, which seemed spontaneous, begins to create an invisible expectation. Because all recurring help builds a silent structure of dependency. And dependence in the real game means a loss of autonomy. It's not about rejecting help, it's about understanding its cost. Because often, the price doesn't come immediately. It comes later, in the form of influence, opinion, or disguised pressure. This is where a cold but necessary principle comes in. Whoever helps you too much, at some point expects to have too much power over them. And that's not malice. It's real human nature, decisions based on real human nature, not on naive idealizations. Machiavelli already made it clear that relationships are often built on interests, not just intentions. And when you get used to depending on someone, you become negotiable. Your freedom comes at a price, even if no one says it out loud. He then begins to notice patterns that he had previously ignored. That friend who always solves things for you starts to have more say in your life. The person who gave you a chance starts to expect unconditional loyalty, and gradually you realize that you're not just receiving help, you're signing invisible agreements. The problem isn't the favor itself, it's the frequency. Because a single favor is generosity, but repeated favors build a power relationship. And power, when not balanced, tends to tip the scales. This is where the calculated use of force comes into play, not as aggression, but as positioning. He starts by doing something simple, reducing dependencies, learns skills that you previously delegated. He solves small problems on his own. It reduces the number of "I owe this to someone" moments, because deep down he understands that loyal and personal armies are not built on emotional debt, but on conscious choice. And those who have nothing to hide decide with more freedom. Over time, he completely changes the way he relates to help. He still accepts it, but with criteria. He still collaborates, but in a balanced way. He understands that independence doesn't mean isolation, it means autonomy. And autonomy is one of the purest forms of power, because when you don't need to, you choose. And when you choose, you are in control. Virtue and fortune come into play here, the ability to support oneself, plus well-used opportunities. He begins to value more what he builds on his own, not out of ego, but out of strategy. Because he knows that each independent step strengthens his position in the long term, and ironically, the less he depends on it, the more people respect him. Perhaps because they realize they can't influence him easily. Better to be feared than loved takes on a new meaning here. It's not about causing fear, it's about not being manipulable. And it is precisely at this point that a new tension arises. If even help creates bonds of control, what happens when people start interpreting what you do in a way that suits them? He begins to notice something curious. People rarely listen to understand, they listen to respond, judge, or fit in. And when something is beyond their comprehension, They don't stop to reflect. They adapt the information until it makes sense within their own reality. In other words, they distort. Not out of malice most of the time, but due to limitations. The human mind hates the unknown. It prefers a wrong explanation to no explanation at all. And this creates a silent phenomenon. Your intention never reaches the other person intact. It goes through filters, beliefs, experiences, and comes out the other side as something else. This is where a brutal principle of reality comes in. You are not judged by what you meant to say, but by what others understood. And that completely changes the game, because from that point on, communication ceases to be about speaking and becomes about controlling interpretation. Machiavelli already pointed this out when discussing the importance of the appearance of virtue. It's not enough to be, you have to appear to be, and appear to be in a strategic way. He then begins to adjust his communication. He no longer speaks the way it comes out. He speaks the way he needs to be understood. Because he understands that spontaneity without strategy generates noise, and noise in the real world becomes narrative, often used against you. A simple example. He says he's focused on his work. Someone interprets that as arrogance. He decides to distance himself from certain people. Someone interprets this as ingratitude. He chooses to remain silent. Some interpret this as weakness or fear. Do you see the pattern? People don't cope well with what they don't understand. So they fill in the gaps, and these gaps are almost never filled in their favor. Therefore, he begins to apply a strategic principle. Decisions based on real human nature, not on the ideal of people will understand. Because they won't, and expecting that is handing control of your image over to third parties. Over time, he masters something rare, strategic communication. He learns to simplify complex ideas, anticipating interpretations. Avoid gray areas where others might project their own insecurities. This doesn't mean manipulating, it means leading perception. Because in the end, perception is power, and those who don't control their own narrative become characters in the narratives of others. The calculated use of force here is not physical, it is intellectual. It's about choosing words, contexts, and moments with precision. It's about knowing when to explain and when to leave it ambiguous. Because sometimes over-explaining also leaves room for distortion. Constant adaptability becomes essential. Each environment demands a different way of communicating, and those who ignore this pay the price in reputation. And it is precisely at this point that he realizes something even more unsettling. If even what you say can be distorted, what happens to people when they have to choose between you and their own comfort? He begins to realize this when the situation changes, not when everything is going well, but when something requires effort, risk, or a firm stance. While everything is light, easy, and convenient, loyalty seems unwavering, but all it takes is a little pressure from the environment, and the truth comes out. Because most people aren't loyal to you, they're loyal to their own comfort, and comfort means avoiding conflict, avoiding losses, avoiding emotional discomfort. So when supporting you starts to cost something, they recalculate. It's not personal. It's instinct, emotional, social, and sometimes even financial survival. And here's a hard truth to swallow. People stay while it's easy, but they walk away when it demands a choice. Machiavelli already warned about this when he said that alliances based solely on convenience are inherently fragile, and those who ignore this build relationships on sand. He then begins to observe key moments. That friend who disappears when you need them most. That colleague who avoids taking a stand when you're being questioned. That person who prefers to remain neutral, even knowing that you are right. Why? Because taking their side can lead to conflict, strain, and exposure. And most people don't want that. prefers to keep their own comfort zone intact. This is where the concept of avoiding being hated takes on a new layer, because often people don't betray you directly. They simply choose not to commit, and this inaction is already a form of choice. He then realizes that true loyalty is rare and expensive. It demands risk, it demands a stance, it demands character. Therefore, it cannot be assumed. It needs to be tested. Over time, he changes the way he evaluates people, not by what they say, but by what they do under pressure. He observes who stays when the situation becomes uncomfortable, those who take a stand when it's easier to remain neutral, who bears the cost of maintaining the relationship. These are few, but they are real, and these are the ones he keeps close. The others? He treats people with cordiality and respect, but without expectations. Because it understands that each person acts within their own limits of courage, and there's no point in demanding depth from those who only operate on the surface, decisions based on real human nature, not idealizations. He continues to move forward, but now with more clarity about who is on his side and why. And deep down, you start to realize something even more strategic. If loyalty is already unstable when everything is going well, what happens when you start talking too much and leave traces that can be used against you? He starts to realize this when he looks back, not for the big mistakes, but for the small conversations that seemed harmless. Those casual remarks, those quick confidences, those comments made on impulse. Everything seemed easy until it wasn't anymore. Because speaking creates a record and registration creates traceability. Each word spoken is like a piece left along the way. In isolation, it doesn't mean much, but when someone puts it all together, it forms a complete map. And this map can be used in ways he never imagined. This is where trust reveals its quietest side. It lets your guard down. It makes you talk more than you should to people who perhaps shouldn't be listening. And in the real world, words don't disappear. They circulate, transform, and return, sometimes stronger, sometimes distorted, but almost always out of your control. He then begins to notice a disturbing pattern. Information that he shared in one context appears in another. Phrases that he said with one intention are repeated with another. And the worst part is, there's no way to prove anything, because everything was said in an informal, light-hearted way, without any weight. But the impact remains. It is at this point that he understands something essential. Every time you speak, you are signing something that can be used later. Not as a contract, but as a narrative. And narrative is one of the most powerful forms of social control. Machiavelli already demonstrated this when discussing the importance of image and reputation. Because in the end, it's not just what you do that matters. What people say you did matters. And often, it's their own words that fuel this. The calculated use of force here becomes the calculated use of speech. Speaking less isn't shyness, it's strategy. Over time, his relationship with communication changes completely. He doesn't stop talking, but he starts choosing more precisely. He understands that silence is not emptiness, it is protection, and that not every conversation needs to be deep. Sometimes, superficiality is enough and safer. He begins to apply something simple yet powerful. The more sensitive the information, the fewer people have access to it. And even within that group, there are limits. Because virtue and fortuna also come into play here, the ability to control oneself plus unpredictable circumstances. He realizes that those who talk too much lose something invisible, room for maneuver. Because everything that is said can be demanded of, reinterpreted, or challenged later. And those who speak less keep their options open, Better to be feared than loved takes on a new meaning here. It's not about intimidation. It's about not being easily read. And it is precisely at this point that an even deeper tension arises. If even your words can be used against you. What to say about relationships where rivalry already exists but hides behind a smile? He begins to notice something unsettling. Betrayal rarely comes from someone who openly hates you. On the contrary, those who don't like you tend to keep their distance. The real risk comes from those who are close by. Someone who smiles, accompanies you, participates, but at some point needs you to slow down. Because its growth creates a contrast, and contrast generates discomfort. Not because you did something wrong, but because its evolution exposes the stagnation of the other, and that's difficult to sustain emotionally. So instead of growing together, some people try to adjust you, to pull you back, to slow you down, to make you fit back into the place where they feel comfortable. And all of this can come disguised as advice, concern, or realism. He then begins to notice signs that he had previously ignored. That phrase, "you're changing," but said not with pride, but rather with criticism. That, "be careful not to get lost," which is actually a veiled request for you not to go so far. That selective encouragement, the person supports you up to a certain point, but then shuts down when you cross that invisible line. And that's when he understands something fundamental. The most dangerous rivalry is the one that disguises itself as closeness. Because it doesn't come with a direct attack, it comes with subtle adjustments. Machiavelli already showed that the most dangerous conflicts are those that are not declared. And here, the game isn't about confrontation. It's about silent influence. Decisions based on real human nature reveal this: people don't want to destroy you. They want to keep you at a level where they still feel safe. Over time, he changes the way he reacts to it. He stops justifying his growth. Stop asking for validation. Stop trying to explain why you're changing, because he understands that evolution doesn't need approval, it needs direction. He's starting to filter advice more carefully. Not all advice is about you. Much of it is a projection of the person giving it. The calculated use of force here is internal. Discipline to avoid contracting, just to maintain relationships. He accepts a difficult truth. Growing up will push people away, not by direct choice, but due to incompatibility of career paths. And that's okay, because constant adaptability includes knowing when to adjust to the environment and when to leave it. He moves forward, quieter, more strategic, more resolute, and deep down, you begin to realize something even more complex. Even proximity can hide competition. What happens when people change completely in the face of money, fear, or desire? He begins to realize this not in theory, but in practice. That person who seemed stable, predictable, reliable, changes. Not gradually, it changes rapidly, almost beyond recognition. And the trigger is almost always the same: money, fear, or desire. Three simple forces, but extremely powerful, because they activate deeper layers of human behavior, layers that don't always appear in common situations. As long as everything is under control, people maintain a socially acceptable version of themselves. But when these factors come into play, the mask begins to slip. And this is where he understands something crucial. Trust based on stability is fragile, because stability is illusory. People are not fixed, they are contextual. And those who ignore this end up surprised. He then begins to revisit situations from the past. That friend who completely changed when a financial opportunity arose. That person who made unexpected decisions out of fear of losing something. That relationship that seemed solid but crumbled in the face of desire or ambition. And everything starts to make sense. It wasn't inconsistency, it was context. Because ultimately, virtu and fortuna are always at work. A person's skill can be but circumstances may reveal something entirely different, and that is why Machiavelli insisted so much on observing behavior under pressure, because that's where true nature appears, not in calm, but in tension. Decisions based on real human nature lead to an uncomfortable conclusion. You can't trust someone for who they are today without considering who they might become tomorrow. Over time, his criteria for trust change completely. He stops relying solely on history and starts looking at variables. How does this person react to money? How do you react to risk? How does one react to loss? How do you react to temptation? Because it is these scenarios that reveal the true pattern. He understands that trust is not a fixed state. It's a dynamic system which needs to be constantly re-evaluated. Constant adaptability becomes essential here. He maintains relationships, but consciously. Without naivete, without idealization, without emotional blindness, because he understands that anyone can change, depending on the right context. And that's not cynicism, it's strategic clarity. And it is precisely at this point that an even sharper perception emerges. If people change with circumstances, what happens when someone already knows their weaknesses and desires intimately? He starts to realize this when he connects everything. It's not just the words, it's not just the changes in people, it's the whole package. Every detail someone knows about you ceases to be just information, and it becomes a key that can open doors or pull triggers. Because knowing someone deeply is, at the same time, a form of closeness. It's a form of power, and few people talk about that side of things. That person who knows what you fear. You know exactly where to press. She who knows her desires knows exactly what to offer. And the one who understands your insecurities, he knows exactly how to destabilize you. This is not theory. It is the silent practice of human behavior. He then begins to observe how this happens in everyday life. An apparently innocent comment that touches directly on an insecurity, a casual suggestion that perfectly fits one of your desires, a mild criticism but directed at something he hasn't yet resolved internally. Coincidence? Almost never, because those who know you don't need brute force. Precision is all it takes. And this is the calculated use of force in its most sophisticated form. It's not confrontation, it's influence. It's not an attack, it's an adjustment. Machiavelli already showed that the most efficient control is not the visible one. It's what happens without you realizing it. And here's where an uncomfortable point arises. Often, manipulation doesn't seem like manipulation. It seems like care. It seems like advice. It seems like closeness. Over time, he changes the way he presents himself. It doesn't stop connecting, but it starts creating layers. He doesn't show everything he feels. He doesn't share everything he thinks. He doesn't reveal everything he wants to know, because it understands that emotional information is the most valuable and the most dangerous. He begins to observe who uses what they know and how they use it. Those who respect and those who exploit. Those who maintain the rules and those who test the limits. And gradually, it adjusts the level of access that each person has. Our own loyal armies here aren't about quantity, they're about quality. Few, but reliable. And even then, with a margin of protection, because he understands that control isn't about completely avoiding exposure, but it's about managing how much and for whom. And it is precisely at this point that the final reflection arises. If all of this is a system, is trust really a feeling or just a story we tell ourselves? He arrives at this point with a strange feeling, as if something that always seemed natural now seemed constructed. The idea of trust is starting to lose that emotional weight, and it begins to take on a more rational, more structural form. Because ultimately, Trust is not a pure feeling. It's a narrative that the mind creates to reduce effort. Thinking all the time is tiring. Analyzing behavior, context, history requires energy. So the brain simplifies, I trust, and that's it. The system turns off the alert, but that's precisely where the risk lies. Because trusting without observing patterns is like outsourcing your judgment, and judgment is one of the most important tools anyone can have. He then begins to see a new game. It doesn't matter so much what the person promises. What matters is what she repeats. It's not the discourse that matters. What matters is the standard. Because promises are cheap, actions are expensive. Anyone can tell you what you want to hear. But few maintain consistency over time. Machiavelli already pointed this out when he showed that the appearance of virtue can be constructed, but practice reveals the truth. And here's a principle that changes everything. Trust should not be given. It must be built on evidence. Decisions based on real human nature require observation, not hope. He begins to do something simple, yet powerful. Look at the history, not the rhetoric, because the past leaves traces, and those traces reveal patterns. Over time, he abandons the idea of blind trust, and it adopts a system. Observe consistency, coherence, and reaction under pressure. See how a person acts when they have nothing to gain, and especially when you have something to lose, because that's where the pattern becomes most clear. He understands that trusting isn't about surrendering, it's about calculating risk. The calculated use of force here transforms into the calculated use of trust. He continues to connect, build, and move forward, but with awareness, with reading, with strategy. Virtue and fortune remain at play. The ability to observe plus unpredictable context. And that changes everything, because now he no longer depends on promises, it depends on evidence. And it is precisely at this point that everything connects. Because, in the end, it's not about trusting less, but to better understand the game that has always been happening. Now let me ask you a direct question. How many decisions have you made in your life based on trust and not in a standard format? How many times have you believed words, ignoring repeated behaviors? How many times have you revealed too much, hoping for understanding, and received distortion instead? How many times have you kept people around, even knowing deep down that something wasn't right? The hard truth is this: the problem was never a lack of intelligence, it was an excess of strategic naivete, because understanding the game isn't enough. You have to play according to him. And that doesn't mean becoming cold, distant, or suspicious of everything. It means stopping operating on autopilot. It means observing more, talking less, testing more, and assuming less. It means stopping giving unrestricted access to anything you haven't yet validated. So the question now is different. What will you start changing from today? Are you going to keep trusting promises? Or will you start noticing patterns? It will continue to provide easy access, or will you start building value with criteria? Because in the end, it's not about having fewer people around you, it's about having the right people, and above all, to have control over your own positioning. If this video made you see something you weren't seeing before, so he has already fulfilled his role, now do the following. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here, you don't learn what's comfortable. You learn what works in the real world, and that changes everything.